Have you ever wondered why, when somebody gets elected to government positions, they lose the ability to speak like normal human beings and they lose the ability to write letters like normal human beings? Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney, guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. I'm going to try to make sense of something that just does not make a whole lot of sense. But let's get into that. We're going to talk today about a unique class action that's been filed on behalf of a series of municipal water districts. And at the end of this, after we discuss the letter filed by certain attorneys general, I'm going to talk a little bit generally about class actions and what you probably should know. You might want to break out a pen and a piece of paper here because there will be some information about chemicals that you'll want to write down and that you'll want to check your public water supply for. So with that introduction, let's get started. Recently in South Carolina, 5 states' attorney generals filed a letter with regard to a settlement agreement or a proposed class action settlement agreement that has been filed in a case involving municipal water systems versus Dupont and other makers of a certain kind of chemical. Let me explain a little bit about what those chemicals are. We need to look at what exactly are PFOA and PFOS. Many of you may recall that I recently did a video about PFOA and DuPont in relationship to a Supreme Court application where they asked to have the decision of the Sixth Circuit reviewed because they felt that it was unfair for the Sixth Circuit to approve non-mutual offensive collateral estoppel. And that issue in that case was PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. Now, in this case, it involves both PFOA and perfluorooctane sulfonate, PFOS, and the related chemicals that are part of that. So they are what are called perfluoroalkyl and perfluoroalkyl substances. That's what PFAS stands for. Some of these chemicals have been in commercial use since the 1940s, and the DuPont's chemical had been in there since the 1950s. There are many of these, but there is a link to cancer. Researchers are using 2 main types of study to find out if the substances cause cancer. Studies in humans have looked at cancer rates in people living near or working in PFOA-related chemical plants and have suggested an increased risk of testicular cancer and kidney cancer. And some studies also indicate a possible link to thyroid cancer. Other studies have suggested possible links to other cancers, including prostate, bladder, breast, and ovarian cancer. Now, the federal regulations require that the drinking water contain no more than 0.004 parts per trillion, and PFOS is 0.002 parts per trillion, and Gen X chemicals 10 parts per trillion, and PFBS, which is another subset of these chemicals, 2,000 parts per trillion. These advisories are not legally enforceable. These are the proposed drinking water standards. You can see those here. And you might want to write these down so that you could check your public water system's water safety report, which is supposed to come out yearly. I believe that's a federal requirement. Okay, so these chemicals are certainly not something you want running around in your body. My personal belief is anytime you have to abbreviate a chemical name because normal human tongues can't pronounce that name, it's probably not something you want dwelling in your body. And anything that somebody refers to as a forever chemical, you definitely don't want that in your body either. But for whatever reason, and I really can't figure out what that reason might be, some of the companies that were involved in making these since the 1940s have just been dumping this stuff in the water right and left. Now, that would be a bad thing if it was done unknowingly. But when you do it with full knowledge that what you're dumping into the water kills animals, then it goes beyond just being wrong and starts being criminal, in my opinion, which is why the attorney generals of the states of Arizona, California, Wisconsin, and the District of Columbia, I may have missed one there, they have all filed a letter with the court in South Carolina that is in charge of the multi-district litigation filed by all of these municipal water plants. They filed it to ask the judge to consider their concerns. They are not direct litigants in this case. They are potential interveners because their rights may wind up being affected by the settlement agreement. And they have concerns, but the way they address them makes absolutely no sense. I've often said, I guess I should say, I've often repeated the aphorism that says that a camel is a horse designed by committee. And this is one of those letters where you look at all of these attorney generals who signed this thing and you conclude pretty reasonably that this was drafted by a committee. It probably went through 15 or 20 drafts with people fly-specking it in different ways, and the resulting letter makes almost no sense. Let's take a look right now. So this is a letter to Judge Gergel in the South Carolina District Court, and it's in relation to the aqueous film-forming foam products liability litigation. You'll see that abbreviated as AFFF products in the letter here as we go forward. And it relates to the City of Camden et al. Versus Dupont, which is the master case in a multi-district litigation. By and through their attorneys general, the people of the states of Arizona, California, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and the District of Columbia respectively submit this letter as amici curiae regarding certain plaintiffs' motion for preliminary approval of class settlement and certification of class settlement and permission to disseminate class notice, otherwise referred to through the body of the letter as the motion. And it seeks preliminary approval for a proposed class settlement between Dupont and entity defendants, collectively Dupont, and public water systems. So it's public water systems that are involved in this lawsuit as class plaintiffs. As originally filed, the settlement agreement was deeply flawed. It required class members to opt out or opt in with no information about how much money they might receive. It asked the court to enjoin other lawsuits against Dupont, and it included those prosecuted by the sovereigns even before final approval. It required agreement to a convoluted and conflicting claims over provision that appeared to act as an indemnity and hamstrung the sovereign's ability to recover PFAS remediation costs from Dupont. And to its credit, Dupont negotiated with a large bipartisan coalition of states and territories in an effort to address a number of that group's concerns, and with the assistance from the court, which extended the deadline by 1 week, the parties were able to resolve those concerns. And they reference here a consent motion to amend exhibits. While the sovereigns appreciate the good faith cooperation of Dupont and the putative class counsel in reaching that resolution, they're concerned about the amount of consideration that's being paid by Dupont to all class members. That amount is approximately $1.185 billion for all PFAS compounds used in all PFAS products. The settlement amount falls far short of what is needed to address the harm DuPont's products have caused public water systems and appears at odds with the value of the scope of the release that would be required in exchange for participation in the settlement agreement. To be clear, the sovereigns do not oppose approval of the settlement agreement as modified by the consent motion. And if that's the case, why are you writing this letter? Well, let's find out. The sovereigns submit this letter to highlight the adequacy of DuPont's consideration under the settlement agreement and to make clear that the settlement agreement should not serve as a point of reference for future PFAS resolutions, particularly those involving the sovereigns. In other words, it's okay to pay the people who are the basically all of the municipal water systems less money, but we don't want you to stiff the states. And several comparisons demonstrate the settlement amount overreaches in its scope by covering non-AFFF products and is insufficient to address the harm caused by DuPont's product. So instead of saying, this drives me crazy, that when lawyers write, sometimes they write things in ways that are just overly complicated and convoluted. What they should have said is, the sovereigns submit this letter to highlight the inadequacy of DuPont's consideration. For heaven's sakes. First, the settlement agreement arises from or is related to all PFAS products, not just AFFF products, which are the focus of the present litigation. But the $1.185 billion settlement amount does not fully account for DuPont's total PFAS liability because it only reflects DuPont's share of the AFFF market for a short window during the 2000s. Thus, the $1.185 billion settlement amount doesn't fully account for DuPont's liability. They talk about how they wanted to reach a global resolution, but they only negotiated for the time frame between 2002 and 2014. The market share liability analysis also does not reflect DuPont's relative culpability in developing numerous PFAS-containing products and understanding the chemical's toxic effects well before other defendants. Despite this knowledge, DuPont continued to sell PFAS-containing products to third parties and consumers without providing adequate notice or warning of the substantial risks PFAS poses to human health and the environment. Second, a recent study by the American Water Works Association predicts nationwide costs for the PFAS compliance dwarf the settlement amount. It says, complying with proposed federal maximum contaminant level, MCL, for PFOA and PFAS, or PFOS, would cost about $47.3 billion for capital costs alone. For these systems, the combined capital, operating, and maintenance costs of complying with this requirement are projected to be about $5.2 billion per year. If these systems are subject to state MCLs with more stringent requirements, then even bare minimum compliance would cost many billions more. Many public water systems may reasonably opt to reduce PFAS concentrations to levels below the applicable MCL to safeguard public health, incurring even greater costs. Third, a recent study by the U.S. Geological Survey found that at least 45% of the drinking water in the United States is PFAS contaminated. Let me read that again. The U.S. Geological Survey found that at least 45% of the drinking water in the United States is PFAS contaminated. Your water system could very well be one of the 45% that has PFAS. So I would encourage all of my listeners and all of my viewers to go and check the latest water quality report that you get from your public water system and look for these PFAS levels. For the foregoing reasons, the sovereigns respectfully request the court's consideration of their concerns outlined in this letter as the court reviews the settlement amount of the preliminary approval purposes. So, what they are essentially asking, without actually asking for it, is the court to essentially mandate that there be more consideration, more money paid here. But they're not making that request because they don't have standing to make it in this case, because they didn't file in this case. So it will be interesting to see what happens here. So it's probably not obvious, but what often happens in class litigation is that you'll have a class of individuals, in this case it happens to be public water systems, but they are represented by private counsel. In other words, the city of Camden is likely not represented by the city solicitor from Camden. More likely than not, they're represented by some high-powered plaintiff's attorneys who stand to gain a lot in terms of attorney's fees if this settlement is approved. So one of the concerns that you always have when you look at a class action settlement, whether that's one that involves your particular class, for example, I was involved in the Hertz auto rental class action that was filed out in Las Vegas, and I didn't think the settlement was appropriate, and I objected to it, and my objection was heard, and the court did not approve the settlement. So you do have a right to object to that. And one of the reasons that you have a right to object is because sometimes settlements are not negotiated fairly or at arm's length. Sometimes what's called a reverse auction occurs. And a reverse auction is this. You've got, in a multi-district litigation like this, and in a class situation, you may have 10 different law firms representing 10 different sets of clients, and they're all clamoring for money out of this deal. So somebody like Dupont goes to them and says, all right, look, who's going to give me the best deal? I'll settle this thing with you, but I need the best deal I can get. And, party A over here says we want $2 billion. Party over here says we want $1.5 billion. The next party says, $1.4 billion. And then finally you get down to $1.185 billion, and Dupont says, I'm going to settle with you. And so you've essentially reverse auctioned. You bid yourself down from these other folks just so you can get a piece, or a bigger piece, I guess, of the attorney's fees. So the adequacy of a class action settlement is one of the things that is of great importance to a trial court when it reviews a class action settlement. And objections are very important in terms of informing the court of where people see problems with it. And the idea that you would agree to a settlement where you don't know what you're going to get, and somebody says, we'll pay you something, I don't know what it's going to be, but we'll pay you something. If you're a class member, why in the world would you ever do that? A couple of years ago, one of the big things was coupon settlements. And in fact, that's what Hertz tried to do in the Sobel case that I was a class member of. They said, look, we'll give you a ticket for a free rental the next time you come to Las Vegas. Well, I go to Las Vegas, about every other year for SHOT Show, but I don't always rent a car. A lot of times I just walk to the hotel because they're all pretty much in the same area. And so I didn't feel like I needed, I just felt like that was not efficient or effective compensation for the injury that I sustained. And it also terribly undervalues the settlement in that you have, essentially you market the settlement as we're going to give you 1 day of free rental. And we value 1 day of free rental at $110 because that's what it costs us. Except when you go and look on Hertz's website, it doesn't cost $110 to rent a car in Las Vegas. So you can definitely game the system with a coupon settlement. And that's why there are objections that are filed. Now, that doesn't mean that every objection is filed with a legitimate purpose. Now, this is not an objection that they filed, obviously. It's a letter informing the court of what their concerns are. But if one of these water systems did file an objection, sometimes the reason that people file objections is that attorney wants to hold up the settlement deal so that he can drive more attorney's fees to him. So he will go and say, look, I'm going to stay with this. I'm going to continue to press this. I'm going to appeal the settlement, and I'm going to tie you up in court for 1.5 years, and you're never going to get your money. There's a good chance I can get this reversed, but I will sacrifice my principles if you would pay me another $400,000. And unfortunately, that tends to work. One of my bosses used to refer to that tactic as being a stagecoach robber. Essentially, the stagecoach has money, so you stick it up. And that's kind of what some of the professional objectors do. There are actually lawyers who go out and find class members in big class actions, and they say, let's object to the class action settlement. And although it is unethical to split a fee with an attorney, with a client, an attorney can't pay a client out of their fee. I suspect that in some instances that's what happens with some of these objectors, because if you object and the settlement gets held up, and then later on you derive some tiny measure of success out of it, the measure of success for the actual individual plaintiff as the objector is likely going to be pretty small. And in fact, in many cases, like mine, which was a principled objection, it blew up the settlement. So I didn't get anything out of that deal. And in fact, I'm not sure how that case ever wound up, but nobody's ever sent me a check. So that is sort of the mechanics of class actions. That a lot of the lawyers who do them are very, very good and very, very principled. And I work with one of them, and he is an excellent lawyer, and he does very good work, and he is not a stagecoach robber. He will insist on getting the full value of a class action settlement and getting it to his clients. Not everybody does that. So if you are ever tempted to join a class action settlement or to join a class, make sure you know who the attorneys are and what their record is and other cases that they've been in. Ask them, how many other cases have you been in? And give me the names of them. And then go and look at those cases in the federal docket or the state docket and find out what objections were filed and how that all turned out for them. Because many, many times what you'll find is that a certain group of lawyers will tend to undervalue cases. So that's what I wanted to add to this to sort of give it some context. As we find out more about how this is all going to work out, I will let you know. I will keep tabs on this if I can and get back to you with it. Today, all across the country, kids are going back to school, which kind of makes me sad. I remember when I was a kid, we didn't go to school before Labor Day was over. And so it kind of saddens me to see kids wind up with a month cut off of their vacation. But they're all going back to school, and the people who have been driving through those school zones for the last 2 months without paying any attention to the school zone speed limit, you need to be careful. You need to watch out. You need to be hyper vigilant. Kids do dumb things. They think, I can beat that car across the street, and a lot of times they can't. So if you're driving today and tomorrow and all of this week, and you happen to go through a school zone, please make sure that you slow down. Children are our most important resource, and only you can prevent hitting a child in a school zone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and we'll catch you down here next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.